Ladies and gentlemen, there's been a lot of reports floating online concerning a mid-generation refresh for both Microsoft and Sony's respective hardware. In the previous generation, we saw the PS4 Pro as well as the Xbox One X, of course, so the question is, would we see the same happen again? Over the past several months, Insider Gaming has reported, courtesy of Tom Henderson, that Sony are even considering releasing development kits soon to specific developers, and these reports actually match quite closely actually what I put out over a year ago. I think it was around March perhaps last year, that I'd been hearing that a PS5 Pro was in development. It was in the early stages, and I'd heard that the performance targets for the Pro were roughly 2 times increase over raster performance and 2.5 times increase in ray tracing performance. And to actually add some additional validity to this, there were also some patents as well, seemingly filed by Sony, which would indicate that, well, there was new ray tracing capabilities for PS5 class hardware that just could not be done on the base machines. So that, plus some other reports online, including from Take-Two Interactive's Strauss Zelnick, who said that he was expecting a mid-generation refresh, and well, tongues started to wag. But the obvious question is, if Sony are considering it, what about Microsoft? Well, the answer is no, at least according to Phil Spencer. It said in regards to whether they would release an Xbox Series X upgrade, that's just not the feedback that we're getting right now. Right now, we are set on the hardware we're having. And this, of course, is a discussion over at Bloomberg. It's paywalled, but I will also leave a link to the Pure Xbox article where I'm nabbing this from. Now, I have to say that in all of the leaks and bits and pieces of information that I personally have been receiving, I have not heard anything about an Xbox Pro console. Aside from very early on, there were some rumours I heard from one source that it was maybe considered, but it didn't really seem to have anything concrete. It was maybe just an internal discussion that Microsoft had, but all of the information that I had at the time, Sony seemed further in development. So there are some caveats. The first is that anything can change, right? We are talking about an industry where stuff can change in a drop of a hat. Now, of course, console development does take quite a while, but if Sony were to get further in development of the PS5 Pro, Microsoft may decide, you know what, maybe this is the best option. Or they could also say, well, what we're going to do is just have a shorter generation this time, or maybe just cost reduce the Xbox Series X as much as possible. I previously reported that I heard about Saban. I've talked about this numerous times, but it was basically an upgraded Xbox S. That doesn't sound very cool on the surface, but it actually had a lot of interesting abilities. For example, it had a machine learning block that was designed by Microsoft, and it was co-developed, of course, by AMD. And there's actually been quite a lot of information, of course, released quite recently with Microsoft's foray into AI. And what I'd heard with this particular block is that it could be doing upscaling, frame interpolation, and some other bits and pieces as well. It was actually quite promising, but Microsoft scrapped it. It also had later iteration of RDNA. I think it was RDNA 3 and potentially Zen 4. But again, it doesn't matter because the project is scrapped, and Microsoft right now are just doubling down on Xbox Series S and Series X. When I asked my sources why did they scrap this, it was pretty simple. That it was just an extra SKU for developers. It was also additional marketing. Plus, in this case, it was a lot harder to just get a marketing message because it was basically Series X performance at Series S cost. And it was quite confusing, to be honest, I think, for a lot of the mainstream market. So the big question is, if Microsoft are saying that they are not going to do this, maybe they did consider it internally and they dropped the plans, or they have just never wanted to do it. It doesn't really matter, at least according to Spencer, they're not planning to do it now. Will this impact the PS5 Pro's launch? Now, there's 2 ways you could look at this, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. The first is that no, Sony are still going to launch the PS5 Pro because they would have a significant hardware advantage. Assume my information was correct at 2 times, and honestly, that's a pretty safe bet anyway, given what we saw with the previous generation, and also the time frame and the hardware that would be available to Sony. I think a 1.7 to low 2 times increase over the base model would be a pretty safe bet, and honestly, I think anything less than that, people wouldn't want to upgrade anyway. So they would have a system that would be capable of much higher resolutions, higher frame rates, yada yada yada. So in theory, if you had a game from, let's say, Capcom, the Sony version, at least on the PS5 Pro, would also look significantly better. However, there's also the counter argument, and that is that this console would presumably be a lot more expensive. And obviously, there is the fact that, well, let's just say that we're in a bit of a recession at the moment. A lot of people are struggling, so potentially this system could cost, I mean, I've heard $600, $700 although of course things can change, and Sony could, for example, choose to sell it at a greater loss. Now, it would be interesting if Sony did release the Pro and Microsoft didn't, but I could also see a world where Sony just said, yeah, well, let's just wait, because it would also seem a bigger upgrade when the PlayStation 6 came out. It will be extremely interesting to see how all of this turns out, honestly. A lot of games right now, like we've seen Starfield running at just 30 FPS, which honestly, I am not surprised about. I wasn't told this by any sources, but just looking at the game, the scope of it, it was quite obvious to me it was going to run at 30 FPS on a console. It's not, to my understanding, a GPU related issue, it is CPU. Because if it was GPU, they could just run, the game at a lower resolution and do some other stuff to lower the impact on the GPU. It's almost certainly a lot of the systems, a lot of the mechanics, a lot of the stuff, a lot of the simulation which is going on, whether it's, keeping track of objects, whether it's physics, NPCs, AI, crap tons of other stuff. It's going to be very taxing. And the developers said that it was running between 30 and 60 FPS in internal builds with the unlocked frame rate mode on. Now, of course, we also don't have the luxury of knowing which scenes were getting higher frame rates. So, for example, were space scenes more likely with combat to run at higher frame rates? Was it, let's say, planetary scenes or tighter quarters with shooting or whatever? Who knows? But yeah, I mean, even Sony are kind of having the same thing. We've seen there's a demo actually of Final Fantasy 16. There's been some frame rate tests, some early frame rate tests, and the game admittedly is a demo. And we are talking, of course, about when demos get released, it's generally speaking on an older build, so God knows what optimizations Square have managed to incorporate in the final build, but the game is typically hitting 40, 50 FPS in performance mode, and I think that's just at 1080p, so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the consoles going forward. I suspect that there is a lot of optimization left in the tank for these systems, but I think maybe if there is enough pressure and people demand enough, well, yeah, as always, let me know what your thoughts are on this one. I am very interested to hear what actually goes on with these systems in the longer term. I would love for there to be a PS5 Pro, and a new Xbox, because I just think it would be really cool. Anyway, speaking of things which are really cool, I'm just going to touch on this really briefly as a quickie. But N32 has actually been pictured in the wild. And by the wild, I mean actually a video from AMD themselves. Oops. So this is actually from a kind of a Forbes discussion with Lisa Su, and obviously with these companies, what they do is generally they allow crews to go in, and it's all sanctioned by AMD. So in this particular case, you could see what, at least to me anyway, and a lot of folks are saying the same thing, it looks like an N32 die. You could see that the MCD, which is in the center here, looks a little smaller than what we have with N31, but another telltale sign is you could see the 4 MCDs which are surrounding the GCD. So this would basically be, I believe N32 is around 200 or square millimeters, and obviously you've got the 4 MCDs. So this is going to be found in the RX 7800 series and lower. I've already leaked quite a lot of information just recently about N32 and what AMD's plans are. I will be very interested to see how these chips shape up. I've already discussed the performance targets, of course, in a previous video. This is going to be up to 60 compute units, 3,840 stream processors. So it's going to be very interesting as well to see what the pricing is. I heard that it's going to be roughly on par with the equivalent in NVIDIA GPUs are. It's a little disappointing to me. I'd hope that they would end up undercutting NVIDIA a little bit, but it is what it is. Anyway, guys, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Apologies if I sound a little bit off for today. Also, I'm not on camera. Unfortunately, last night I got absolutely wrecked with food poisoning, so I am a little, well, let's just say I'm recovering and leave it there. But, yeah, I should be okay the next day or so. It was, not pleasant during the time, but you know, with food poisoning you get better a lot faster. And so I think it was some salmon that I was cooking, so I might have been a little bit off or whatever. I did heavily nuke it, but it's the only thing I can think it can be, unfortunately. So that sucked. With that said, take care of yourselves, guys. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.